Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, the Wish Spell. In the Wilds, Genies. And in the Tavern, what would you do if a wish was available? Hey everybody, I hope everyone out there is having an excellent day. Excited to talk all about wishes today. Before we get into that, just like to thank everyone for bearing with us as we had a couple of weeks off as I worked on some other projects and also spent time with my family after the passing of my grandfather. Thank you very much for just the outpouring of support and again for being patient with us as we took a couple of weeks off. But I'm excited to be back in the chair recording and talking about wishes. Before we get into it, just a couple of announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We would appreciate it, however you listen to the podcast, if you would give us a rating, whether that be on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen, just give the podcast a rating. It helps us spread the word about Plot Hooks to more people. And it would be awesome of you to support us on Patreon. There's lots of awesome perks up there for our patrons, lots of homebrew information, the Sunday magic items for our upper tiers, and of course, being involved with Plot Hooks Adventures, our new show, which is now 3 weeks into its launch. We've just finished the first session with the 3-part release of that. Our second session begins here shortly. We've got a whole new cast of characters that are going to be popping up this time. Sean, Shannon, and Clay from Paradise RPG. David, the DM at the podcast From Afar. Lex from at Call Me They. And Andrew, our patron guest. We hope you're enjoying Plot Hooks Adventures as much as we are. And again, head over to Patreon if you want to be able to have an impact on future episodes or even appear, like Andrew did, on a future recording. But with that out of the way, let's get into the Wish Spell. Now this is a little bit of a legendary spell in Dungeons & Dragons, despite not being nearly as widely used as ubiquitous spells like Fireball. Wish is a 9th level spell, so some campaigns finish without ever even getting to a level with 9th level spell slots, and even if you do, Wish is only available to the Sorcerer and Wizard class, and technically Bards as well, who can get it through their Magical Secrets feature, even though it's not technically a Bard spell. Yet, even though it's so restricted in its potential use, it's one of the most talked about spells in the entire game. Players talk about the best way to utilize it and how to best phrase their desire to make sure that the wish comes true as intended. Dungeon masters agonize over whether to allow the spell, and if it should be balanced further if they do, and if so, in what way? It truly is an amazing spell, and as the description of the spell states, it's the mightiest spell a mortal creature can cast. By simply speaking aloud, you can alter the very foundations of reality in accord with your desires. So today we're going to look at this amazing spell and talk about some potential good ways to handle Wish that preserve the fun of it, but also try to make sure that it doesn't derail the story you're trying to tell. Because that's a concern we have so often with Wish, right? Because we are afraid that allowing this particular spell or just passing it off as written, we're afraid that it's going to derail the story. My argument with this spell is going to be that it is awesome and it can be used in our games to tell great stories if it's handled properly and in a manner which both the players and the DM agree on. I suppose before we go any further into potential good ways of handling Wish, we should read the spell. And hold on to your butts because it is a doozy. For Wish, the basic use of this spell is to duplicate any other spell of 8th level or lower. You don't have to meet any requirements in that spell, including you don't have to have any of the components. The spell simply works. It simply takes effect. That's the basic use of Wish. Alternatively, you can create one of the following effects of your choice. 1, you can create an object of up to 25,000 gold pieces in value that isn't a magic item. It can't be any bigger than 300 feet in any dimension, and it appears in an unoccupied space you can see on the ground. 2, you allow up to 20 creatures you see to regain all hit points, and you end all effects on them described in the Greater Restoration spell. 3, you grant up to 10 creatures that you can see resistance to a damage type you choose. 4, you grant up to 10 creatures you can see immunity to a single spell or other magical effect for 8 hours. For instance, you can make yourself and all your companions immune to a Lich's life drain attack. 5, you can undo a single recent event by forcing a re-roll of any roll made within the last round, including your turn. Reality reshapes itself to accommodate the new result. For example, a Wish spell could undo an opponent's successful save, or a foe's critical hit, or a friend's failed save. You could force the reroll to be made with advantage or disadvantage, and you choose whether to use the reroll or the original roll. And 7th, we have the open-ended aspect of Wish, which states you might be able to achieve something beyond the scope of the above examples. State your wish to the Dungeon Master as precisely as possible. The DM has great latitude in ruling what occurs in such an instance. The greater the wish, the greater the likelihood that something goes wrong. The spell might simply fail, the effect you desire might only be partially achieved, or you might suffer some unforeseen consequence as a result of how you worded the wish. For example, wishing that a villain were dead might propel you forward in time to a period when that villain is no longer alive, effectively removing you from the game. Similarly, wishing for a legendary magic item or artifact might instantly transport you to the presence of the item's current owner. So those are the 7 other potential effects of Wish. The last part of the spell states that the stress of casting this spell to produce any effect other than duplicating a spell weakens you. So that means that any of these 7 examples, the 6 specific ones, and then the 7th broad thing that was listed, anything that is past just copying a spell endures the following effects. It says that each time you cast a spell until you finish a long rest, after enduring this stress, you take 1d10 necrotic damage per level of that spell. That damage can't be reduced or prevented in any way. In addition, your strength drops to 3 for 2d4 days. For each of those days that you spend resting and doing nothing more than light activity, your remaining recovery time decreases by 2 days. Finally, there's a 33% chance that you are unable to cast Wish ever again if you suffer this stress. So obviously, that is an extremely powerful spell. There's no theoretical boundary on the upper limits of the spell's capabilities. Just as you can wish to duplicate a spell with its normal use, you can wish to be the ruler of the whole world. And that is why it's both so controversial and so legendary. It can do so much, and it has the capability of, as I alluded to earlier, derailing the story that the group is telling and going in a completely different direction. How can we make sure that it doesn't do that? How can we make sure that it's a boon for our storytelling and not something that throws everything off? There's lots of powerful spells in D&D, but this one is so powerful that it's difficult to balance. So to begin the conversation, let's look at the balances of the spell as written, because there are in fact limitations, downsides to the spell that are written into the book. I think oftentimes this gets lost in the mythos of the spell itself. It's so incredibly powerful and completely reality altering that we forget the built-in downside. But there is a downside. If you do something past just replacing an 8th level or lower spell, you are going to have a 3 strength for 2d4 days. You have a 1 in 3 chance of losing that spell permanently. And once you cast that spell, if you cast it in battle, then you are prohibited really from being able to cast a lot more spells because you're going to take necrotic damage for each spell level of another spell that you cast after it. Those are some prohibitive detractors. But at the same time, this built-in balance just doesn't fully get up to the reality-altering nature of the spell. That strength decrease is huge. But it's spellcasters who most often get wishes. It's spellcasters who get wishes, unless somebody comes across an object that gets them one. The only classes that can cast one naturally are wizards, bards, and sorcerers. It's not a barbarian with a polearm who actually cares about their 3 strength necessarily. But another built-in aspect is the clear indication in the spell's description that the DM has great latitude in both the interpretation and the scope. And that lets the player know who chooses this spell that things can go wrong with the spell. And we're going to look a little bit more into this as time goes on. And I'm going to argue as we go through the rest of this conversation that that second part of that, the limitation that is described as far as the scope of the spell, is the key for handling this spell in a balanced way that is both fun for everyone and allows great latitude for the player to still be able to make the wishes they want to make. So there are 5 things that I want to go over as far as ways that we could potentially further balance wish or handle wish in a way that we can make sure that it doesn't derail our stories. The first is that latitude in interpretation effect. Generally, this means balancing wish by interpreting it in a literal fashion, making it hard for the player to cast the spell correctly. Let's say that a player wishes, I wish to be stronger than anything in the multiverse. Well, you can balance the spell by interpreting that literally, without regard for the unintended consequences since the wisher didn't specify. You can describe how the player's strength score increases to 31, which is stronger than any other D&D creature, but their size doesn't change, and so now their muscles are so large they can barely move, and now they have a speed of 5 feet. And this literal interpretation does make sense in a lot of ways, because you aren't wishing to an entity. Again, it's bards, sorcerers, and wizards who cast this spell, so there's no connection to a divine force or a patron or anything like that that's giving the spell its energy. It's pure manipulation of the fabric of reality. It's like speaking to the impersonal universe itself, and so it makes sense that there could be a literal interpretation. And personally, I like doing this to a certain extent. Again, it's built into the spell because it's important to give the player pause before casting it, and it limits the scope of what they try to achieve. You can also do things like the casting of the spell has to be done in a single sentence or something like that. That way they understand that with this great latitude in interpretation, you can't wish for giant open-ended things. But I don't go too far this way. I don't go looking for a way to interpret the wish wrong intentionally, because that's not fun. That comes between a player and a DM. It can make a moment that harms party dynamics. You don't want the players to feel like you have it out for them. You don't want it to become a mini game where the players are just over in one corner trying to figure out the best way to word it, and the DM is in the other corner trying to figure out the best way to twist it into something that works for their advantage. You don't want to turn it into a player versus DM moment. So because of this, while I think it is good to have some literal interpretation and some limit in terms of the amount of words you actually use, like limiting it to a single sentence, I don't think this is the best way to balance Wish by itself. There's too many feel-bads, too much potential for the spell to stop being cool and just turn into that DM versus player minigame. The second option is to play up the strength loss. Again, it makes your strength 3. That is so prohibitive. And playing up that backlash can give you some real balance to the Wish spell. Let's run off some of the creatures whose stat block also has a strength of 3. Cat, Weasel, Owl, Sprite, Awakened Shrub. What about creatures higher than you in your weakened state? Sturges, Homunculi, Badgers. Heck, you, after casting this spell, are literally disadvantaged in an arm wrestling contest with a badger. You are equal in strength to an awakened shrub. And you as a DM can certainly play this up. You can make it to where this strength of 3 means you can't carry anything or even physically fight at all. I mean, you can't lift a sword with a strength of 3. A cat can't go around lifting a sword. You can't tension a bow with a strength of 3. You can't wear armor with that strength. And so playing up that strength can be a real way of balancing it. And again, this is something that I would do a little bit because I think it is legitimate. Having a strength of 3 should prohibit you from doing certain things. But again, I don't want to go too far with it, because I think it just makes it less fun. And in most situations, the players are just going to rest for the 2 weeks or whatever it would take for the player to actually get back to full strength. And then this effect is not going to actually change anything. So I don't think this is the best way of balancing Wish. The third option is to increase the percentage of losing the spell. It could be that you think that rolling a percentage tie and losing the spell on a 33 or lower is not quite enough to fully balance it. Maybe you bump that up to 50. Maybe you make it to where half the time you can never cast the spell again if you use it for an effect that is more than just copying the effect of a spell. Heck, even if all you can do with Wish is copy the effect of a spell, it's still very impactful because you don't need material components. You can cast a spell which typically you would have no access to because there'd be no material components for you to actually be able to cast it. So you can increase the percentage chance of losing that spell. This, honestly, to me, though, is an option that I don't like at all. I'd rather do the first two than this particular option. I don't like changing rules as written so drastically in my favor as a DM. I don't want to make my players feel bad. Of course, you can do that as a DM if it's something that you and your players agree on, but it's just not something that I like to do. I'd rather find other ways of balancing it, like playing up those aspects like we've talked about that are already written into the spell. I'm even less likely, though, to choose the fourth option, which is to not allow the spell at all. It is certainly potentially game-breaking, and so one of the easier things to do as a Dungeon Master is just not allow the spell in your game. But personally, I just think that there's so much potential here. It's a really cool spell, and if a player has worked hard enough to get all the way up to 9th level spell slots, I want them to be able to take advantage of that. And if that's Wish, then hey, I want them to be able to do that. I have nothing against anybody if you think that taking away the spell is the best option for you and your group. Go for it. That's perfectly fine. It's just not something that I would do. But that is the fourth option. So we've got these 4 options: the latitude in interpretation, the playing up the strength loss, the increase in percentage of losing the spell, and the limiting the use of the spell altogether. But the 5th option is, again, like I said earlier, what I would choose, and that's limiting the scope. Again, it's listed in the spell that the DM can use this. It says, and I quote again, "The spell might simply fail. The effect you desire might only be partially achieved." It is worded into the spell that you might not be able to get exactly what you wish for. And when you think about it, this is all you really need. You have license at any moment to just say that in response to any wish, that only part of what they wished for was accomplished. Plenty of people, I'm sure, don't like this method because there is some backlash to it. The downside to this particular method is real. It essentially means that your players don't get what they wish for exactly. And that can lead to some feel-bads. But it's the way that I like to balance it, because a simple conversation up front between the DM and the player who is thinking about choosing wish, about just telling them, hey, this is a very powerful spell, but there are limits to what you can use. If you wish for all the money in the world, you're not going to get that. And just having that conversation up front about the limits to the scope gives you so much latitude as a dungeon master in the moment to be able to make a decision and a ruling which can give the player a great percentage of what they asked for, but at the same time not ruin the story that the group is telling. Again, this isn't perfect, and I do like to mix in things about the interpretation and playing up the strength loss as well, but I think the biggest thing is just that conversation between the DM and the player that just says, hey, if you try to do a spell that's too outlandish, it's just not going to have its full effect. And generally speaking, players steer clear of those dramatic, extreme kinds of wishes anyway. So I think by balancing it with some of these methods, it can be a real asset to your storytelling. But I want to hear from you. If you're a DM, how have you used wish? If you are a player, what's your best wish story? It's certainly a spell that gives us some of the best memories that we've all had, because it's so crazy and can do so many fun things. And that's one of the reasons I don't want to eliminate it from my games, because it is so incredible. But I'd be interested to hear your feedback. Contact us on our social media or our email, plothookspodcast@gmail.com. But I think for now, that'll about just wrap up the prime material. Let's head out to the wilds and continue this theme by looking at some genies. All right, we're out here in the wilds. Today, the genies. Now, there are 4 different varieties of genies in Dungeons & Dragons, and we're not going to look at the stat blocks of any of them today. We can look at the different ones perhaps in a future episode, but today we're just going to look at genies on the whole. And in D&D, they are elemental creatures. They're created when the soul of a sentient creature binds with the primordial matter that is in a particular elemental plane. This is rare, and it is the only way that genies form, so these entities are quite rare, but powerful creatures in the multiverse. They're extremely prideful and decadent, with a very high self-importance, almost like dragons in that way. And they dwell in brilliant abodes filled with wealth, and, according to the lore, slaves. Now, this is something that is built into the genie lore, and it's something that as DMs, we have to be willing to change if we want to include a genie in our story. This is one of those things where conversations with your players is important about what they feel comfortable with and what they don't feel comfortable with. Because as written, Slavery is one of the big things that is important in genie society. Slaves are viewed by them as living property. And without any property, a particular genie has no merit. And even though a lot of genies are good and they treat their slaves very well, treating them as honored members of their household, they're still slaves. And that reality is something that can be very triggering and problematic. So it's something that we as DMs, again, have to be willing to work out of the narrative if it's something that's going to be problematic. But regardless of what you choose in that instance, the importance of property is tantamount in genie society. I would personally just remove slaves from this equation and just treat this element of genie society as just the need for just regular property. But regardless, the genie goes through its life loving the authority, the flattery, and everything that comes from having an immense amount of property. As such, because of how much they love their freedom and wealth and their high view of self-importance, they hate being bound into service themselves. And yet, many mortals try to do that because each individual entity, like we said, they're elemental creatures. Each individual one controls the particular element with which they're associated with. And some of the most powerful ones can even grant wishes. And so, wizards and other magicians will try to bind a genie to their service. And that is one way that you could use them in a story, which we'll get into in just a little bit. Now, despite the fact that genies are formed whenever the soul of a sentient creature kind of connects with elemental forces, they don't retain any connection to that form. They don't have any memories or anything like that. They just become a completely new entity. And once they do, they just work their way up, continuing to grow and grow in both power and wealth until they reach the highest level of their echelon in society, the noble genies. The noble genies, which are so powerful and so worthy of worship that many people have mistaken them for gods or treat them like gods. And some will even wield this power and demand this worship from others. Overall, genies are just very egotistical, prideful, decadent, and very powerful elemental creatures. As we mentioned, there are 4 varieties. The Tao, which are associated with the elemental plane of earth. The Jinn, which are related to the elemental plane of air. The Ifrit, which are the elemental plane of fire genies. And the Merid, which are the genies from the elemental plane of water. Again, we're not going to get into any of the stat blocks, and we're not going to get into any of the real specifics. But what we want to talk about is just using genies in our story. How do we use these type of creatures? One way is actually straight out of the Unearthed Arcana, where there's actually a warlock class where the patron is actually a noble genie. And that is an interesting twist on your typical warlock, and that could be a way that you connect a genie into your story. You could also have the genasi interaction. Genies don't mate with each other. The only way that a new genie is formed is through that process that we mentioned earlier. But sometimes a genie would mate with a humanoid, and the offspring that would be produced from such a union are the genasi. If you have a genasi member in your party, perhaps working in that genie connection is a way of utilizing this unique creature in your storytelling. Perhaps that's something that the party's genasi wants to get out from under, because genies are not known for being good. They're just known for being quite powerful. They just lord that power and lord their wealth over others, just desiring more and more self-importance. And so maybe distancing themselves from that reality is something that is part of your party's genasi's character arc. Another way you could use a genie was if it was bound somewhere. Maybe the party could be having to set it free because it's been bound to protect a particular location, or it's been trapped inside of a particular object. And perhaps the party could actually get a wish, if it's a powerful genie, by releasing it from its prison. And that's the last area that we wanted to talk about for using a genie. You could use them as a wish giver. Maybe the party wants to accomplish something, and the only way they know to do it is by getting a wish. And so they travel to the elemental planes, seeking out one of these powerful noble genies and completing a task for them in order to get granted a wish. And if you are interested in using the genie as a wish giver, there's a sidebar to this effect on page 144 of the Monster Manual, just above the genie stat block, where it describes the various magical capabilities that genies can have if it's one of these more powerful genies. And of course, in this particular setting, the interpretation factor plays a lot more into it, because here you have a not necessarily benevolent force who would be willing to manipulate the wish in a certain way in order to accomplish what you wish for, but also be beneficial to the genie at the same time. And in that particular circumstance, I actually like that interaction, because there it's not a mini game, as I mentioned earlier, between the player and the DM. It's a mini game between the player and another character, an NPC, a genie. And it's the genie that's trying to manipulate the player. And in that way, that little mini game actually becomes fun, because it's part of the game. It's part of the social interaction. It's not just an outside of the game situation where the players are trying to fight with the DM. But those are just a couple of ways you can use these interesting creatures. And we'll get into the stat blocks of some of the specific ones at a later time. But I think for now, it's about all the time we have out here in the wilds. Let's go back to the prime material plane and head over to the tavern and get some refreshment. All right, we're out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook: what would you do if a wish was available? Now, what I mean by this is, say there's a particular situation, almost like I mentioned earlier, where the players need a wish, or maybe they don't even need a wish, but just an opportunity for one pops up. How do you do that? Well, there's lots of different ways that you can just pop this option into the game. You can have them come across a certain artifact where they realize if they have all of those artifacts, then when they're put together, they can use it to create a wish. That, of course, being a reference to Dragon Ball Z, the popular anime, where if all the Dragon Balls are together, you're able to make a wish. You could have a competition that the players hear about, perhaps buy a genie, where a wish was the prize. And all kinds of people would turn up to fight for that. There could be a trial that you're trying to do at this kind of competition, where everyone is trying to compete together to solve puzzles or complete challenges. Or it could be a tournament style, where you're actually able to fight in safe combats. Safe meaning without the risk of actual death. And the winner of the tournament could get that wish. You could also just interject a wish into the game, again, as we mentioned earlier with the genie, where they come across an object where the genie has been imprisoned, and they're able to, by freeing it, get a wish. But by setting up a scenario where the players know that there's an option for a wish and that they have to actually figure out a way to actually get it, whether that be a competition or finding an artifact that they are aware of or collecting a bunch of artifacts, that can become a whole arc of a story where the players are trying to accomplish something and they're trying to get a wish in order to do it. And now they have to go through this whole process of competing or gathering in order to actually fulfill their quest. And at the same time, they could be having a lot of social interactions with people who have the same goal as them to be able to get this wish. And this can just be a really interesting tier 3 arc, perhaps an arc where the players are trying to accomplish something. They're really powerful already, but they're not quite powerful enough to obviously have things like the wish spell themselves. And this is a really interesting arc that you could throw in for something like levels 13 to 15 or something like that. You, of course, have to be careful with how you implement this, just like with everything that we discussed earlier today. But if done right, it can be a really interesting story. But I think that's about all the time that we have for this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Be sure to check out our Patreon. Check out Plot Hooks Adventures, which airs Wednesdays at 3. Thank you all very much for listening. From all of us here at the Plot Hooks team, I'm Samuel. Thanks from Matt, Mike, Steve, Dave, Zach, Becca, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.